26th April, 1929. Karachi, British India. A strange plane lands after a long flight. The longest flight without refueling, in fact. 50 hours and 37 minutes in the air later, she lands at Karachi. The aircraft is the Fairey long-distance monoplane, or Fairey Postal. She is powered by a single 570 horsepower Napier Lion 9A with a 2-blade propeller. Cruising at 110 miles per hour, she falls short of the distance record. With only 8 gallons of fuel remaining when she lands at Karachi, she could not have reached her original destination of Bangalore, nearly 1,100 miles further. It would take another shot for Fairey to claim the trophy. Attempts at the record using a Hawker Horsley like this one have continually failed. Hawker and Fairey are regular rivals, and Fairey wants the chance to one-up their competition. Now the Air Ministry wants a plane designed to break the record. In the tight-purse 1920s, the project is ostensibly for the Postal Service, hence the name Fairey Postal. With full knowledge of the demands that will be placed on her design, the hallmarks of Fairey are all over her blueprints. Signature Fairey design elements, paired with over 1,000 imperial gallons of fuel, carry the 2-person plane distances unheard of for heavier-than-air vehicles. Sylvanus Albert Reed, the Collier Trophy-winning inventor of the modern propeller and genius of Curtiss's engine works, inspires or even designs Fairey's propellers. Fairey alone has the rights to his designs in Britain and her dominions. The flaps are one of the first versions of Fairey's own design. While not perfected for some time and not patented until 1941, the Fairey-Youngman Flap helped to increase lift, stability, and range. Like a Junkers flap, it extends down and outward before being set at the desired angle. Fairey's can also be set to a negative angle. This improves safety and handling characteristics, especially in a dive, and will be an important design element in Fairey's bomber designs for years to come. As for the Fairey Postal, the second of the 2 examples had minor improvements, such as spatted gear and an autopilot, and would be more successful. She sets the record for distance flying from Walvis Bay, Southwest Africa, to the testing grounds at Farnborough on the 6th through 8th of February, 1933. Born into a traditional, high-church, middle-class family, Charles Richard Fairey attended the public schools of the Merchant Taylor School and Ardingly College before his father died, changing the family financial situation for the worse. As the family faced financial strain, he chose to enter the trades. At Finsbury Technical College, he read for engineering and chemistry, and was apprenticed to Jandas Electric Company. Showing adept leadership and an innate technical genius, he was in charge of installing the arc lamps and electrical lights at the Heysham Docks at the age of 19. Taking a job at the Finchley Power Station as an analytical chemist, he began designing, building, and flying model airplanes. He was renowned as a natural innovator, and his designs were ahead of the cutting edge. He soon moved from models to full-size aircraft, when in 1911 he was hired to work on the Dunn Flying Wing. In 1913, at the age of 26, he became the chief engineer at the respected Short Brothers firm. When he tried to enlist in the Great War, he was rejected from both the Royal Navy Air Service and the Royal Flying Corps for medical reasons, and since his profession was considered essential. This led him to found Fairey Aviation in 1915. He took with him another Short Brothers designer, the Belgian Ernest Oscar Tips. And in 1918, they took on Marcel Lobel, who remained chief designer until 1940. Lobel would design some of the most famous aircraft of World War II, including the Fairey Swordfish, Battle, Fulmar, Albacore, and Barracuda. He would drive Fairey to become one of the most famous, innovative, and valued aviation companies in the British Empire. Under license, Fairey's old employer's Short Type 827 would be the first aircraft to be produced by Fairey. Even here, the shape of Fairey aircraft to come is seen in the sleek fuselage and the rudder that resembles a boat's. Fairey would also produce under license the Sopwith 1.5 strutter Pursuit Scout during the war. The hand of Fairey would first be seen in the Hamble Baby. This 1917 aircraft was technically a license-built Sopwith Baby floatplane. Unlike the Blackburn license-produced babies and Sopwith's original models, Fairey's examples were manufactured with a distinct difference. Fairey had changed the overall plan of the wings and empennage. One of the greatest differences was the inclusion of the camber gear that ran along the trailing edge of both wings. A patented Fairey innovation, this permitted the flap to be lowered during flight, improving handling when desired by using flaps as ailerons, at a time when most aircraft neither had flaps nor required them. Another change was the vertical stabilizer. The Sopwith Baby's empennage was unique, but Fairey's made it work better by applying what he had learned at Short Brothers. He also redesigned the floats, making the aircraft more maneuverable, more stable, and more hydrodynamic. The first true Fairey product would be the F.2 prototype heavy fighter, designed in response to a Royal Navy Air Service need for a long-range pursuit aircraft. It was not adopted, but it was unique as it was a 3-seat fighter the size of contemporary heavy bombers, and predated the idea of the heavy fighter by almost 2 decades. The hallmarks of Fairey designs are seen with the vertical stabilizer structure, the narrow elongated fuselage, and the wing with huge ailerons to improve maneuverability. The wings were very large and well supported. These characteristics and the 3-bay unstaggered wing design would be seen in many Fairey biplanes of the future. The Fairey Campania, a design which saw service with both the RAF and RNAS in the Great War and in the intervention in Russia, had similar features as tested in the Baby and F2, and it excelled in its role. It was specifically designed for service at sea, performing anti-submarine missions rather than coastal duties, and was named for the HMS Campania aboard whom she would serve, a liner turned seaplane carrier. It is perhaps appropriate that the first and last Fairey aircraft in service were anti-submarine aircraft. During the anti-Bolshevik intervention, Campanias flew off the HMS Nirana in the first air-land-sea combined operation in the assault on Meduski Island in the Arkhangelsk campaign. The Fairey 3, of which there were 4 varieties, the 1, 2, 3D, and 3F, saw a few weeks of mine-spotting service during the war, but served in the Arkhangelsk campaign. It would continue to serve in frontline squadrons as both a land and float plane until 1935, and as a target tug until 1941. This design saw the narrow, pointed nose join the unstaggered, sturdy wings, large ailerons with camber gear flaps, and ship-like empennage all come together, years before Hawker designs of the 30s would imitate the streamlining features Fairey had already made its own. The 3D would go on to serve in 13 nations, although many had only single examples. The Netherlands bought a number of them, as shown here, as did Australia, Portugal, Sweden, the Argentine, Greece, and Chile. The design submitted along with the larger Fairey 3 was the N9. While not accepted for service, the design was deemed suitable for catapult trials by the Royal Navy, as seen here. This would be the first aircraft catapulted by a Royal Navy warship, the catapult vessel HMS Slinger. There is no float on the tail, as it would obstruct launching, so instead a flotation device was affixed to the tail, and the forward floats designed to keep the plane level. Here we see that first catapult launch, flying off the deck of a warship, as so many Fairey aircraft would be launched in the future. The Pintail was a heavy departure from Fairey designs, especially where the wing and tail are considered. Designed to meet a fighter reconnaissance requirement, the placement of the wing restricted lines of sight, and it was rejected. However, it continued in testing due to its superb performance. 3 of them were ordered by the Imperial Japanese Navy. These Pintail 4s had the wing placed above the pilot's line of sight. It also saw the beginning of the scoop-shaped blunt nose that many of the W and V-engined Fairey aircraft would share. The Fairey Flycatcher fighter of 1922 would also see a blunt nose design for mounting its 400 horsepower Armstrong Siddeley Jaguar 4, a powerful engine for the time, and one that gave the little craft a top speed of 133 miles per hour. The type also had the trademark Fairey wing, tail, and flap structures, and landing gear could readily be exchanged for floats on every craft, as seen behind His Majesty George V on board the Furious. 196 flycatchers would serve from 1923 to 1934 and see combat when flying out of China Station in anti-piracy strikes. Beloved, maneuverable, sturdy, and reliable, the flycatcher saw a great deal of use in the Royal Navy drills and war games of its day. It would be behind the stick of a flycatcher that the Royal Navy would design their naval aviation strategy and combat tactics, which were to be used in the war to come. The next design off the Fairey boards would be the N4 Recon flying boat, with 3 being built in 1923. The first large aircraft that Fairey took their hand in since the F2 heavy fighter, it was designed to meet a request for a very large flying boat, and Fairey gave the Admiralty the largest flying boat up to that day. With 625 horsepower Rolls-Royce Condor 3 motors mounted in tandem pairs, the 5-seat giant reached 115 miles per hour, could fly for 9 hours, and carry 1,000 pounds of bombs, in addition to 2 defensive machine guns. A beast that could fly faster than many fighters of her day. But Admiralty was unfortunately losing interest in flying boats, and this design, which would be one of the best in the world, would be put aside. The 3 would continue to make test flights, but they would never see service. In that same year, the Fairey Fawn would fly. The resemblance to the Pintail is unmistakable, albeit with a more normal Fairey empennage. The blunt nose, sturdy landing gear, unstaggered wings, and untapered fuselage betray her heritage, and Napier Lion W12 motor, later upgraded to a supercharged Lion 6. While 75 served the combined purpose role of bomber, Army cooperation, and reconnaissance platform, she never did replace the seemingly immortal de Havilland DH-9A in service. A huge engine, limited visibility, and it was a heavy craft that performed only marginally better than the DH-9. It would see service in 3 squadrons for only 2 years, then relegated to auxiliary and RAF Special Reserve units. The very similar Fairey Fremantle would be built in 1924, much superior to the Fawn, and with many design elements harkening back to the 3 and the F9. The Fremantle was designed to meet a contract ostensibly for a long-range recon aircraft, but with the goal of making the first circumnavigation of the globe. Built like a boat rather than like an aircraft, no internal bracing was necessary inside the spacious fuselage, and the aircraft was able to take off in a still sea with a full load, with as many as 7 passengers. However, Douglas having already achieved the feat of circumnavigation, none would be ordered. Yet another contract that failed to meet expectations was the late 1925 private venture project, the Firefly 1, a sleek biplane capable of a then incredible 186 miles per hour and armed with 2 Vickers guns. The Marcel Lobel design showed a great deal of promise. Unfortunately, the RAF found 2 faults. One was its mixed wood-and-metal construction. More than that, however, was the use of the American Curtiss D12 motor. This excellent engine would also see service in the Curtiss Hawk fighter planes for years, but only a single example of the Firefly 1 would be built. 1925's shadow over Fairey would continue with the Ferret. Only 3 of these fleet reconnaissance aircraft were built. When the Fleet Air Arm rejected the design, it was submitted as a utility aircraft to the RAF. It performed well and was the first all-metal design that Fairey constructed, but it was not selected for either competition. Many of the design features, however, would be seen in other FAA orders, as Fairey returned to sleek, aerodynamic trends and narrow fuselages and rounded vertical stabilizers and rudders. The Fairey Fox was the perfect example of this new direction. A private venture aircraft with a sharp, piercing nose, higher tail, and for the first time staggered wings. Lobel's updated design of the Firefly originally did use the same Curtiss D12 motor. Although this engine had powered the Schneider Trophy-winning Curtiss CR, the RAF did not want an American engine. The all-metal, high-performance Fox 2M and Fox 2 could reach 200 miles per hour, and in later versions nearly 230 miles per hour. So advanced was the performance of the Fox compared to other aircraft in service, the RAF restricted its pilots to 140 miles per hour in war games. However, she would only serve as a strike bomber with No. 12 Squadron RAF after being fitted with a Rolls-Royce Kestrel engine. The majority would serve with Belgium and Switzerland only retiring theirs in 1946. A subsidiary was begun in Belgium, Aviation Fairey at Rosselies, and it would be the very backbone of the Belgisch Militaire Vliegwesen. Some improvements were made as well by the Belgians, as shown here in a modification to which a canopy had been added. Serving until the German invasion, most would be destroyed on the ground, but 75 sorties would be flown by various models of the Fox during that brief engagement, even downing a Bf-109. This brings us to the long-range monoplane, right where we began. The needle-thin aerodynamic design that earned it the nickname Eversharp after the fountain pen and mechanical pencil company, together with the large wings, rounded tail, and scoop-shaped nose, were all inherited features of the F2, the Fairey 3, the Ferret, and the Fox. Fairey's luck would continue to waver, as the Firefly II, seen here with the early flat-topped fin, being the only departure from Fairey's design trends. While created to replace the Fairey Flycatcher, the design was not picked up by the RAF. Once more, rival Hawker would win both general contracts for which the Firefly had been submitted, with their famous Fury and Nimrod fighters, both of which were slower than the Fairey Firefly, but had the all-metal construction insisted upon by Fleet Air Arm. Again, the Belgians would purchase and manufacture the model, fielding a total of 87 of the all-metal 3M variant. The RAF would field a single example. Ironically, they employed a design they rejected for one of the most demanding roles they could offer, training the high-speed flight in preparation for the 1931 Schneider Trophy, which would be won by Supermarines 6B. Continuing their string of advanced designs with poor luck, Lobel's Fleetwing fleet reconnaissance aircraft, derived from the Firefly and Fox, would also not be picked up for a contract. Although only one was built, what is notable most is the fin and rudder, where the shape has been rounded out and refined in departure from Fairey's past. The Fleetwing would lose her contract once more to Hawker, this time to the Hawker Osprey. This rare footage of the Fleetwing landing on a carrier shows the one RAF purchased example. Landing gear was soon exchanged for floats, and she would see service as a part of the Schneider Trophy team, where she was used to test sea conditions prior to flights. The stream of poor luck in Fairey would end with a 1930 Fairey Seal design. A variant of the 3F, this fleet recon plane returned to the Fairey trademark unstaggered wing, while also refining the fin design first seen in the Fleetwing. The fuselage would also be slightly taller, and like many of Fairey's fleet-destined designs, the landing gear could be exchanged for floats. The Seal entered service in 1933. With a modest speed of 138 miles per hour and a bomb load of 500 pounds, it was primarily designed for shell spotting more than high-speed reconnaissance. While the 91 in RAF and FAA service would begin to be replaced after only 3 years in frontline squadrons with another Fairey design, the immortally famous Fairey Swordfish, the Seal served throughout the 30s as a reliable support aircraft and air gunnery trainer. The final 4 would serve with the fleet as photo reconnaissance platforms as late as 1943. The Seal's land-based equivalent was the successful Fairey Gordon light bomber and general-purpose craft. While the RAF was moving towards all-metal construction and advanced instruments for safer flying, the Gordon was an exercise in the basics. While her instrument panel was more reminiscent of the Great War than the 1930s, her all-wooden construction and the accessibility of her engine made an excellent aircraft for service in the Empire, such as these of No. 47 Squadron stationed in the Sudan, an appropriate place for an aircraft named the Gordon. With a powerful Armstrong-Siddeley Panther 2A motor, this development of the 3F saw service in its primary role in the Second World War with 3 Egypt-based RAF squadrons. Here one can appreciate the Gordon in action as they fly over the pyramids on a bombing exercise. The Royal Egyptian Air Force operated Gordons before and during the war as well. In Iraq, she served as a trainer at RAF Habaniya, although these would return to a bombing role in the defense of the base from the rebel Iraqi forces in 1941 with notable success. New Zealand, China, and Brazil would also purchase the Gordon, although today only one survives. At the same time the Seal and Gordon were flying, this advanced bomber also came off the Fairey drawing boards. While the heavy-looking spatted landing gear and open pilot and gunner positions may seem out of date, in 1930 the heavy bombers being fielded by the British were biplanes with light bomb loads. The Hendon competed against two nearly obsolescent models and was a step many years in advance of 1930, let alone the 1922 minted Vickers Virginia bombers it was meant to replace. However, the prototype seen here and known as the Fairey Night Bomber would crash in 1931, and newer models underwent extensive training. The steel tube-structured monoplane features can be seen as a harbinger of later aircraft, such as the Junkers U-86, the Vickers Wellington, and the Armstrong Whitley. But its time would come later. It would lose the contract to the proven, reliable, and cheaper Handley Page Hayford biplane, with its notably unique design. 4 years down the road, Fairey would submit the G4-31 in answer to a request for a multi-role aircraft to replace the Fairey Gordon and the Westland Wapiti. It had many shoes to fill as it was expected to perform level bombing, dive bombing, Army cooperation, reconnaissance, air ambulance, and torpedo bombing roles. Uniquely, the pilot sat to port rather than in a centered position to allow for an internal passageway between the gunner's cockpit and the area beneath the pilot used as a bomb sighting, navigation, or litter position. It was also fitted with windows and a door to starboard for ease of access from the ground, especially useful when acting as an air ambulance. This here is the second design of the prototype, with a higher rounded fin design. She performed well and was sturdy, stable, and successful in performing the desired roles in every regard. Unfortunately, she would lose the competition to the more conservative Vickers Type 253 biplane. In the end, neither she nor the Vickers would be produced, the RAF instead deciding to focus on a Vickers private venture submission, the Wellesley monoplane. Turning to the Fairey S930, we see the beginning of some of Fairey's most famous and influential aircraft. Not that the S930 is particularly famous on its own, but rather that it is the first step on a long trip. The eponymous Air Ministry specification that led to its development asked for a gunnery spotter and recon plane, although it took 3 years from a 1931 grant to bear fruit with this single example. With shallow sweep and stagger to its foldable wings, it did not have the telltale flaps of other Fairey designs, but did have the sleek, aerodynamic features that would be seen in the future. Only the top wing had ailerons and leading-edge slots, and the condensers for the steam-cooled V12 Rolls-Royce Kestrel were in the center portion of the top wing. To overcome visibility challenges with a low-set wing, as in the Pintail design and others, the pilot had cutouts in the wings near his cockpit, and the gunner had a deep and long cockpit in which he might move around. While the S930 was fitted with interchangeable floats and landing gear, as were many Fairey designs, it was found to be easy to handle on the water and was mostly flown as a floatplane. In the air, the plane was maneuverable and stable, but slightly heavy in the controls. By 1934, the Royal Navy no longer asked for an aircraft to meet the role, and a new requirement was published, which combined the M130 torpedo bomber and S930 spotter reconnaissance specifications into the single S1533 specification. Meanwhile, Fairey used the knowledge gained with the S930 to improve another spotter recon aircraft with the added feature of torpedo bombing capability. This contract by the Royal Hellenic Air Force would be similar to the S930, but have a radial engine and be called the TSR-1 for Torpedo Spotter Reconnaissance 1. The aircraft tested well, especially as a land-based plane, but was lost in a crash in September 1934. By this time the RAF had grown interested, and they supported an improved version called the TSR-2. with improved balance and wing design, as well as the Bristol Pegasus 2M 635 horsepower motor. The unique rudder design was kept, while the cowling was enlarged, the wings swept back more, and the spats taken off the undercarriage. The arrestor hook was also strengthened. A legend was being born. A general-purpose three-seater with interchangeable undercarriages for land or sea operation, and the capability to operate as a gunnery spotter, reconnaissance platform, dive bomber, level bomber, torpedo bomber. The Air Ministry signed a contract for the Fairey Swordfish. A mere 68 Swordfish were contracted, with the first deliveries of the Mach I arriving in 1936, and No. 825 Squadron was the first to be equipped, turning in their Fairey Seals that July. No. 823 Squadron would replace their Seals a few months later. By the beginning of 1938, the Blackburn Baffin and Blackburn Shark had been replaced by the Swordfish in 5 squadrons. 13 squadrons were outfitted with the Swordfish when war broke out in 1939. By 1940, Fairey's production of the Swordfish was in full tilt, but she had other contracts to meet as well. Blackburn was brought in to pick up demand, and within the space of a year, a new factory was built from scratch to produce Swordfish, these models being known as the Blackburn Blackfish. Armed with rockets, torpedoes, depth charges, and bombs, the Swordfish certainly lives up to her designation as an all-purpose aircraft, in spite of her nickname, the Stringbag. Over 20 second-line and training squadrons would use the Swordfish during the war, but her performance as a torpedo bomber and scout would earn her her immortality. The first torpedo strike of the war was a Swordfish from the HMS Furious on 11th of April 1940 against a German destroyer in Trondheim. A Swordfish from the battleship HMS Warspite would fly as a spotter during the Battle for Narvik on 13 April, and was able to do so well that all German forces were sunk or scuttled, for a loss of 7 German destroyers and not a single Briton. The so-called Stringbag may have appeared to be one of the Allies' most obsolescent planes, yet she did well in a war where the enemy rarely had fighter cover at sea to challenge her. As if that weren't enough, while spotting for the Warspite and her escorts, the pilot spotted U-64 and executed a dive-bombing attack that sank the U-boat in under a minute. U-64 would be the first U-boat to be sunk by Fleet Air Arm. The Swordfish, mocked by commanders and pilots alike before the war for its dated construction, would be well respected as she counted victory after victory in the Mediterranean, North Sea, and Atlantic, serving aboard capital ships, carriers, and in coastal command squadrons. Most famously, the Swordfish would put a torch to the Italian naval aspirations in the Mediterranean with their strike on Taranto and cripple the Bismarck. In one of the most famous naval engagements of the war, a torpedo from a Swordfish struck the Bismarck's rudder after the massive battleship's advanced anti-aircraft defenses found themselves unable to target an aircraft flying at speeds so slow at wave-top altitudes as few aircraft but the Swordfish could. The Mark II would enter service in 1943. In addition to a more powerful Pegasus 30 motor, the lower wings undersurfaces were now metal and able to hold more rockets and launch them in greater safety. Likewise, the Mark III would also be manufactured with the Pegasus 30 and metal undersurfaces, but instead of a torpedo, it mounted an ASV Mark X radar radome between the landing gear. The final Swordfish produced would be NS-204, a Blackburn Mark III, completed on the 18th of August, 19. The Swordfish would serve with 40 squadrons, 23 of them first-line squadrons. Fairey would build 692 of the 2,391 produced, the rest being Blackburn products. Her final missions would be in January of 1945, hunting submarines on the Norwegian coast. She would be replaced by the Fairey Barracuda, outlasting even her own replacement, the Fairey Albacore. The last squadron would retire the Swordfish just after VE Day, on 21st of May 1945. In 1946, the last training squadron retired their Swordfish. British, Canadian, and Dutch squadrons flying for the British were the only nations to fly what is likely Fairey's most famous creation, and what was intended to be nothing more than a general-purpose aircraft for the small Royal Hellenic Air Force. While the venerable Swordfish would last over a decade from first flight to retirement as one of the last combat biplanes in the world, the aircraft designed immediately after was very modern by comparison. The Fairey Fantome was also a Marcel Lobel design, but not for the RAF. The Fantome was made for the Belgische Militaire Vliegwesen, competing at Hosselis as a replacement for the Firefly. However, it would not be adopted into any force. 2 examples were picked up by the Soviets and given to their Spanish Republican proxies, but they would see no combat. The modernity of the design compared to others of its day is not only in construction and performance, thanks to a 925 horsepower Hispano-Suiza 12Y CRS engine and 270 miles per hour top speed, but also in its armament. This would be the first Fairey design with a 20mm autocannon, and the only Fairey design with a 20mm autocannon. In addition to 2 machine guns, it was quite heavily armed for its day, especially when one considers that the Bf-109 had the same arrangement for much of World War II. This brings us back to the Hendon. The Hendon finally entered service in 1936. This was the RAF's first low-wing monoplane of all-metal construction, which is incredible considering that it is 1936, and the RAF is still behind in bombing tactics, strategy, and philosophy. The 14 Hendons produced certainly stood out among their RAF compatriots. Although it only saw service for 3 years with a number of 1-5 squadron, and was quickly replaced by the Vickers Wellington in 1938, she continued in radio and ground training operations through to 1939, even testing some of the first radar sites. Another leap forward for the RAF would come in 1936 in the form of the much maligned Fairey Battle. Replacing rival Hawker's Hart and Hind aircraft, a 3-man bomber with design traits that would be seen throughout Fairey's monoplane designs, the Fairey Battle was very modern for its day in 1936. The fin and rudder design took much from the recent work with Fairey 3 derivatives, including the Swordfish, while the tapered nose and thin fuselage had the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine's shape to thank, as well as the experience of Fairey's many advanced, albeit commercially unsuccessful, designs. As in previous models, the crewman serving as bombardier and observer would lie prone beneath the pilot's seat to use the bomb sight. She also boasted Fairey's first stressed skin construction, although control surfaces remained fabric-covered. Designed by Marcel Lobel to meet the British specifications that had been set, the intention was that Paris would be the likely target of British bombers, and it was driven by the fear that heavy bombers would be banned by disarmament treaties. The Battle was a sleek machine indeed, easy to fly and offering a spacious cockpit. She was the first Merlin-engined aircraft in service, although she would soon be joined by the Hurricane and Spitfire in the months coming. In a unique arrangement, a normal bomb load for the Fairey Battle would be 4 250-pound bombs, each nestled in its own cell. 2 more bombs could be carried on racks, or 2 500-pound bombs suspended from racks within the bomb cells, with another 2 250-pound bombs on outboard racks. Although she had the same bomb load as the Blenheim, she had only half the engine power. By the outbreak of the war, she was already being assigned to reserve squadrons, as her slow top speed of 257 miles per hour put her at a disadvantage when faced with fighter opposition, a shortcoming experienced also by contemporaries the Val, Stuka, and Vought Vindicator. Without a replacement, she went off to France and made the first RAF victory on 20 September 1939, downing a Bf-109. Originally intended to bomb German industrial targets in the Ruhr and Saar, she would instead be sent on unescorted interdiction and close support missions, where the combination of a slow speed, poor armament, and no self-sealing fuel tanks made a death sentence for the pilots and crew. Between the 10th and 16th of May, 99 battles were lost in France. Another 100 were lost before the return to Britain on the 15th of June 1940. By October 1940, she was no longer to be found in RAF frontline service. She would continue in service, however, in other air forces. The South Africans would use the battle successfully in their bombing campaign of 1940 over Italian East Africa. In strikes over Mogadishu and Italian air bases throughout southern Ethiopia and the Somalilands, the South Africans managed to fight off the Regia Aeronautica successfully. Italian fighters, the CR-32 and CR-42 biplanes, would dive on formations of battles in an attempt to get as many of them as they could in one sweeping attack. However, the battle, while dated for 1940, was still more advanced than the biplane fighters it was facing. Soon enough, the battle would eliminate Italian logistical support and air support in East Africa and Somaliland as Allied troops liberated the first lands from the Axis hold. The final showing of the battle in combat would be at the hands of the Royal Hellenic Air Force. Following the quick Greek campaign, the battle would only be seen as a training aircraft and test platform. While this would be a death knell for many aircraft, this was actually the battle's finest hour. With 802 being shipped off to Canada as part of the Commonwealth Air Training Plan, the Fairey Battle would serve until mid-1945 as a trainer that prepared thousands of Canadian and other Empire forces to fight the Axis. Two-seat, dual-control training battles were also built and used. Others served as target tugs, and others yet would see themselves being used as test platforms for new engines and other fittings, such as the turrets seen here. The battle may have failed in the fields of France and the mountains of Greece, but over the farms of Canada, she served an essential role in preparing countless men to take to the skies for the Allies. The next design off the Fairey drawing board was the Seafox, a conventional naval spotter floatplane. 66 of these little craft would serve, and despite a low stall speed and 106 miles per hour cruising speed, her high landing speed at sea and the limitations of the weak Napier-Rapier H motor drew criticism. Her most famous engagement would be in the Battle of the River Platte, where she would spot the gunfire for Ajax, Exeter, and Achilles, leading to the Graf Spee's demise. Turning to a more modern page, the design after the Seafox off the board would be the P-434, designed to meet Air Ministry specifications for a close support tactical bomber. While the specification was withdrawn as the need was no longer pressing, two examples would serve as stepping stones for Fairey and perform vital work for Britain. In 1938, one became a testbed for designs that would result in the Fairey Firefly. The first example, K5099, would be flown out of Aurillac-Lakenheath from 1938 through to 1939 in one of the most dangerous exercises in the RAF, purposely crashing the craft into cables hung beneath barrage balloons to test their effect. While the cables were only weighted underneath the balloons rather than attached to tethers, they were still dangerous exercises. The knowledge gained through over 300 planned collisions was essential to national defense. The aircraft was nimble, pleasant to fly, and was able to perform the task safely despite all the risks and what little assistance that wing reinforcement offered. And here we take a departure from the warplanes of Fairey and see a very unique design, and one that would cost Sir Richard in excess of £1 million of his own money. The FC1 Airliner was unique in Fairey's inventory as it is a civil design. In the cost-conscious 30s, the FC1 was designed to maximize cruising efficiency. With engines at half power and the huge Fairey-Youngman flaps to add lift and low-speed control, the FC1 could be expected to fly 1,700 miles, 2,700 kilometers, with 26 passengers. The flaps took up nearly a third of the wing's chord. Their size and extension made it nearly a sesquiplane, offering a tremendous boost in lift for minimal drag. Ultimately, this full-scale mock-up would be the closest that the FC1 would come to production. The outbreak of war meant the cancellation of the streamlined passenger plane that could very well have been a hallmark in international travel. Sir Richard hoped that after the war it would be picked up by the Air Ministry once more. However, it was not, and it faded into obscurity. By 1938, Fairey was already designing a replacement for their Swordfish. The Fairey Albacore, with enclosed cockpits, constant speed propeller, and Taurus 12 motor, she was steady in dives, although her top speed was a mere 160 miles per hour with a combat load, and only 170 miles per hour without a combat load. This would prove to be a severe handicap. 15 squadrons flew the Albacore through the North African and Sicilian campaigns, but her polar disaster in the raid on Kirkenes and Petsamo, and her failed attack on the Tirpitz were more typical of her performance. Recalled from service over the course of 1943 and 1944, she would be replaced by the Fairey Barracuda. In one squadron, she would even be replaced by the Swordfish, the very plane she was intended to replace. Canadian pilots from May to July of 1944 found the heavy controls, sluggish speed, poor maneuverability, and lack of armor a risk combination, making them easy prey to anti-aircraft and fighter opposition. The 800 Albacores built proved to be a liability much more often than they were ever found to be an asset. It was in monoplanes that Marcel Lobel's designs would see success. 1940's Fairey Fulmar was a descendant of the Battle and the P-434. Designed to be a carrier, fighter, and reconnaissance platform, the Fulmar was not particularly maneuverable, but was stable, rugged, easily produced, and boasted a long-range, 8 rifle-caliber machine guns, folding wings, and a much cleaner airframe. Unusual for a single-engined fighter, she had a pilot and a navigator. This was done so that in her reconnaissance role, she would not be compromised over long spans of ocean waters. The Fulmar served in a variety of campaigns, from tracking the Bismarck on his fatal journey to flying cover over the Swordfish at Taranto and Cape Matapan. Protecting convoys from the Arctic to Malta, the Fulmar was effective as a fighter against the Luftwaffe and Regia Aeronautica, especially where the more maneuverable Hurricane and Spitfire had yet to be deployed. 8 fleet and 5 escort carriers would boast Fulmars, and she would serve in 20 squadrons over the course of the war, mostly in the European theater of operations. As the Sea Hurricane, Martlet, and Seafire became more readily available, the Fulmar shifted more towards her reconnaissance role. Intruder missions were also flown, although the Barracuda was being introduced to fill this role and more. Unfortunately, the Fulmar did not fare well in the Pacific. Like most aircraft which succeeded in Europe, it could not stand a chance against the Zero. By 1942, they were on their way out and only saw limited use as a cam catapult fighter on convoy duty and maritime night fighter. Despite its short career, many aces would be at home in a Fulmar. It was the leading aircraft of Fleet Air Arm in the war with 112 victories to only 40 losses. Many of those were to Japanese fighters. Top FAA ace, sub-lieutenant, later commander, Stanley Orr scored 8.5 of his victories in a Fulmar. 1940 would also see the Barracuda, and this was another number of firsts for Fairey. Designed as a replacement for the Albacore, the V-12 Rolls-Royce Merlin 32 offered a maximum speed of 240 miles per hour and a cruising speed of 195 miles per hour, nearly twice the speed of the Albacore. Later versions had Griffin motors, improving performance even more. Serving in 24 first-line Fleet Air Arm squadrons, she would also replace the Skua as the FAA's dive bomber. She was the FAA's first all-metal aircraft and was unique in her construction as a high-shoulder monoplane with a horizontal stabilizer also mounted at a high position. The large Fairey-Youngman flaps also helped with range and stability, while simultaneously performing the function of a dive brake. Her innovative folding wing mechanism meant more could be carried aboard carriers, and with a single torpedo or up to 1,500 pounds of ordnance, she was adequately armed, although she lacked forward-firing armament. Entering combat in July of 1943, the Barracuda saw service in the North Sea and in the landings at Salerno. She would damage the Tirpitz in April 1944, although her slow speed would lead to future missions being unsuccessful. In the Pacific, the heat and humidity would reduce her performance by almost a third. Her range was crippled, but she would serve in the Pacific in nearly equal numbers as the Grumman Avenger between April 1944 and VJ Day. 1941's Fairey Firefly would prove that the third time is a charm for the name indeed. She was more traditional in terms of the Fairey heritage, and she served as an FAA long-range carrier fighter and anti-submarine warfare aircraft. She served from 1943 all the way through to 1956. Unlike most World War II aircraft, which were used in the 50s, she would continue to be produced into 1955. Entering service in July of 1944, she served as a reconnaissance and anti-shipping aircraft in the North Sea and as an escort fighter. From carriers in the Pacific, she would be used as an anti-submarine, anti-shipping, interception, ground attack, and general fighter aircraft. The Firefly would also be the first British aircraft to fly over Tokyo and would be instrumental in striking targets in the Japanese home islands in preparation for an invasion. Canada too would fly 65 Fireflies, although post-war, from 1946 to 1954. Australia bought the Firefly together with Hawker's more advanced Sea Fury. and would use the aircraft through the first half of the 1950s. She succeeded in close air support, naval gunnery spotting, interdiction, and strike roles throughout the Korean War and the Malayan Emergency. She would also be used as a trainer and target tug, finally retiring in the early 60s after serving with the Royal Dutch Air Force in 1962, protecting Dutch New Guinea from the newly independent Indonesia's threat. In Commonwealth service, she was replaced by the Fairey Gannet. As the war came to a close, Fairey's last project was just being produced. Flying for the first time on 5th July 1945 after VE Day, the Spearfish torpedo and dive bomber was designed to fly from the planned Malta class of fleet carriers. When the carriers were cancelled, so was the Spearfish. With a 100-mile-per-hour advantage over the Barracuda, and loaded with rockets, 50 caliber machine guns, and a torpedo or 2,000 pounds of ordnance, she would have served well had she been needed. The move from rifle caliber to 50 caliber machine gun is notable, as is the defensive armament, the guns being placed in a remote control barbette and controlled by the bombardier gunner from within the aerodynamic bubble canopied cockpit. With only 5 made, one of which never flew. This footage here is surprising in that it exists at all. Yet here she is being shown off at Hendon with the rest of Britain's might, after a war that everyone was glad to see finally end. The wartime production from Fairey's factories would not be limited to her own aircraft, many of which were built under license by companies like Blackburn. Fairey would also produce 500 Beaufighters and 600 Halifax bombers. Her adaptability and success in reliably producing quality aircraft would be seen after the war, with Fairey having contracts to produce under license the advanced de Havilland Vampire and Venom planes. After the war, Britain took years to economically recover. Fairey would only have one contract with the military following World War II, and this would be the Fairey Gannet. It would also be perhaps her most unconventional design. The separate pilot and observer canopies with the second observer in a third rearmost cockpit of his own was an arrangement that, although strange, helped with airflow over the vertical and horizontal stabilizers. It also made plenty of room for the bomb bay and retractable radome beneath the rear observer. Powered by 2 Armstrong Siddeley Mamba turboprops mounted side by side to power contra-rotating propellers with kerosene, turbine fuel, or diesel, she eliminated the need for the highly flammable petrol that piston engine aircraft had required, making carrier operations notably safer. She was also efficient aboard carriers, thanks to the unique inverted gull wing, which folded into a space-saving Z shape. A total of 260 anti-submarine Gannets would be produced, including 3 prototypes, replacing the venerable Douglas 81 Skyraider, and serving from April 1954 into the mid-60s. Thereafter, the 6 carrier onboard delivery conversions would be kept on fleet service, together with trainers and 9 electronic countermeasure conversions. She also served with the Australian Fleet Air Arm until replaced by rotary craft in Indonesian naval service into the 1960s, and finally with the Bundesmarine's Marinefliegergeschwader 2 and 3 until 1966. A further 44 Gannets would be manufactured according to the Airborne Early Warning modifications. While intended at first to be merely a modification of a standard Gannet, these would be totally redesigned aircraft. The AEW-3 had no retractable radome, no bomb bay, and reconfigured crew positions which mirrored the Skyraiders. The wing was also redesigned, and the large guppy radome was permanently mounted. Serving only briefly from 1959 to 1963, she had no clear successor except a handful of Avro Shackletons which were leaving service. This left the Royal Navy without an airborne early warning system, a serious handicap in modern warfare. Forced to make do with hastily fitted Westland Sea Kings, which took 11 weeks to complete, the Royal Navy paid the price dearly for letting the Gannet go. In the liberation of the Falklands from the occupying Argentine forces, the lack of an airborne early warning system would contribute to the loss of 6 British vessels and hundreds of sailors, marines, and Fleet Air Arm men killed or wounded. The Ardent, Antelope, Sheffield, the Sir Galahad, the Atlantic Conveyor, the Coventry, would be lost to Argentine A4 Skyhawks, Super Altendaus, and Pucaras with little warning. Who knows how many deaths may have been prevented in that campaign of liberation had the Gannet not been withdrawn so prematurely. On a brighter note, the post-war accomplishments of Fairey were not limited to the Gannet, although she had no other military contracts. The same company that created the much maligned Battle and Albacore, which would be remembered for the Stringbag biplane, would also develop some of the most advanced and famous aircraft of the 20th century. The path began with the Fairey Dart 1, or F.D.1. Ordered by the Ministry of Supply, this was the first delta-winged British aircraft when it first flew on 12 March 1951. Originally designed as an experimental aircraft and a possible vertical takeoff emergency interceptor, the single example was difficult to handle, although the knowledge gained was necessary in learning the characteristics of delta-wing flight. Unfortunately, she would crash in 1956. In the meantime, the Delta II would fly in October of 1954. Two of these record-breaking examples would be built as it became the first jet aircraft to exceed 1,000 miles per hour in level flight, setting a new speed record in 1956 at 1,132 miles per hour. The design was explored for possible use as a high-speed interceptor, although the 1964 proposal for a Delta III never manifested. Instead, she remained an experimental aircraft, and while testing in France to avoid sonic booms over the British countryside, she offered the Dassault company a chance to get up close and personal. So close was the attention they paid, they copied the features of the Dart II to develop their Mirage 3. Poor visibility when taxiing would lead to the development of the drooped nose. The wings were highly swept and razor-sharp, and were one of the thinnest wings ever designed. She was the epitome of aerodynamic principles. While Britain would look to missiles for defense rather than a high-speed interceptor, the aircraft was hardly finished with inspiring the world. The BAC-221 was a remanufactured example by Fairey in Bristol and completed on 7 July 1961. New hydraulics, modified intake ducts, and increased fuel capacity were all improvements that allowed the craft to reach Mach 1.6 during flights from 1964 to 1973. She also had an elongated undercarriage in order to explore taxiing behavior and ground safety. This would be crucial knowledge since the BAC-221 was truly created for but one purpose. That purpose was the Concorde. Through the BAC-221, the flight and ground handling characteristics of the supersonic passenger aircraft were explored, and her features were incorporated into the luxury liner of the sky. The wing design, the nose, the empennage, and the elongated landing gear were all the result of Fairey design. Unfortunately, Fairey would not last long enough to brag of their success and innovation. In 1977, Fairey liquidated her assets. As Britain looked to missiles for defense and faced an unstable economic decade, Fairey dried up and exhausted herself. This was not only so in Britain. Fairey's civil division in Gosselies, Belgium, saw EO tips go back into design after the war. The primer, first flown in 1938, was again produced in 1948. While only 3 would be made, Aviation Fairey would continue to try to re-establish itself despite a crippled private aviation industry in Europe, thanks to both economic depression and the cheap military surplus aircraft that abounded. The minuscule and acrobatic T-66 Nipper would be successful as a kitcraft and as a pre-assembled product, beginning in 1957. But most of Aviation Fairey's production was in Hawker Hunters, Lockheed F-104 starfighters, and civil aircraft like the Britten-Norman Islander and Trilander. As Fairey UK and Aviation Fairey were collapsing under financial stress, Aviation Fairey would be bought by the Belgian government as a Société Nationale de Construction Aérospatiale in 1977 to ensure production of the newly adopted F-16 fighter. Who would have guessed that the Belgian subsidiary of the company that made the Fairey Battle would be building the F-16 Fighting Falcon? Sonaca is now a private company with a revenue of nearly $900 million and contracts with space agencies, Airbus, Embraer, Dassault, Boeing, and others, including the manufacture of UAVs for the Belgian land component. From humble beginnings, Fairey Aviation would be one of the most notable and influential aircraft companies of the 20th century. Alive in popular memory for the anachronistic success of the Swordfish torpedo bomber and the shortcomings of the Battle, Fairey was a company that pushed the edge more often than she ever took a backseat to progress. The sleek lines of the only supersonic passenger airliner the world has ever seen would not exist if not for 2 men who left Short Brothers to build the better airplane they knew they could. Thank you so much, and I do want to mention that being the first of these full-length documentaries, this one did take a lot of time to produce, and your support and encouragement are always very welcome. If you are enjoying the content, please consider supporting these creations with a subscription on Patreon for as little as $3. After all, every little bit counts. Don't forget to hit the share button so your friends and your groups can also enjoy what you just did. And don't forget, check in daily for new content. This is Claire, and I am the Warbird Mistress.